Today, I'm happy to introduce Lasha Antadze, a Georgian tech entrepreneur and blockchain innovator, co-founder of Labs and creator of Rarimo, a protocol that lets people prove who they are without exposing personal data. He started working on digital public systems in Ukraine, helping governments reduce corruption using blockchain. Later, he founded Shelf.network, backed by Techstars, which successfully connected vehicle auctions across borders and was acquired. Today, Lasha leads Rarimo, a project that raised around $10 million in 2022. His key idea is verifiable anonymity, proving things like age or citizenship without revealing your full identity. This technology allows governments to build secure systems, people to protect their privacy, organizations to meet KYC rules without collecting extra data. Lasha represents a new generation of leaders building trust, privacy, and digital identity for the future. He's helping create the privacy layer for digital governance.
Was this waiting that it was the kind of a wait that, okay, if not today, like tomorrow or day after tomorrow, the world gonna be blockchainized and we're gonna see this kind of digital revolution. It's been like 15 years going on since the so-called blockchain revolution. And unfortunately, it didn't really touch that many aspects of our lives. But we can proudly say that at a 15 years time frame, we're seeing its real impact into this kind of financialized world and how it has reshaping the payments to like the ownership to the international finance and how money and value is stored in general. But I'm still a kind of a believer of its vast capabilities. And I believe that kind of next revolution that it is ripe to change is something that has to do with overall identity, digital identity, and using this digitalized version into forming the new forms of governance. Why blockchains are pretty groundbreaking and what was like, apart from the technology, what I early on liked, and I think the primary differentiator from any other type of digitalization or like any type of like reform is that these networks, and we can move to the next slide. These networks have introduced for the first time these credibly neutral systems. What does it mean? So it is a capability where things and rules and the infrastructure works without anyone's control. And because these systems are not controlled or managed by single entities, we're having this kind of trust formation to this kind of credible, neutral, shared infrastructure that is managed more or less by different sizes stakeholders at the same time. And another important aspect that was not part of other systems before that was that everything blockchain provides is how it's built. It's open source. Its code could be like reviewed by anyone else. And it's the kind of a shared public good we're using for record keeping or like coordination or like putting the certain data that is state of the data, as it's called, to coordinate better. And what's most important, it scales horizontally. So it's amazing kind of instrument that we were given like 15 years ago. And my path started into like reimagining how these credible neutral infrastructures could arrive in the modern societies, and why do we need these kind of environments. And if we move to the next slide, I think like especially as we enter this AI race and the world, we see that like informational asymmetry and this forming of these so-called bubbles, right? Narrative bubbles within the social media, within these different communities, even without calling or like distinguishing sides who's right or wrong. Everyone labels themselves with the same adjectives, right? So they're always majority, they always are right, the people are with them. And these kind of narrative driven splits have become more and more common within the politics, within the society, within this, like, I don't know, different movements, even within this like activities, right? So we see these little formations all around. And in a way, social media and current internet does not solve the purpose of being credibly neutral environments where we could like really measure the sentiment or understand how genuinely people or the part of the nations or the cultures or the movements are really feeling. So in a way, when we started working on something called FreedomTool, and I'm going to explain what it is, and let's move to the next slide. We reimagined the kind of participation online that could be done in a completely different way, right? So it was not only just about solving our Eastern European political problems of governments and the state sometimes being able to like overtake the election systems, but in a way we imagined this as a credible neutral system where each civilian could have enforceable rights. And that's something like I will always highlight, right? So it's not about just showing the sentiment, but it's about designing those systems that way that civilians within the society have an actionable capacity to just show or vote or join a certain statement, sentiment, movement, or something they don't like, and have an enforceable, verifiable, but super safe instruments to participate in the overall governance, state governance. So in a way, the FreedomTool that we designed, I always call it this kind of a early conflict resolution technology. So it's kind of like ability, if you allow your citizens or a certain groups to early on express their sentiment, or with this, I don't know, launch petitions with enforceable outcomes, or like trigger digital votes or pauses to a certain incentives, or even like show their priorities in terms of like budget spending on anything like that. And this kind of delegation of a certain rules directly to a civilians, it's not only if it's not really only just an efficiency tool, but it's for me this kind of a as well early conflict resolution tooling, because it enables you to dissolve these narrative bubbles and the radicalization that we're seeing currently around us. So if we move to next slide, we called it a FreedomTool, which is the same. It's a public good technology that enables you as a civilian or any participant to basically have this gadget, and you can call it a ballot box or a kind of tool to express yourself within this pocket. And they are how it works and like what's behind it is that it uses the governmental ID. So anything that has an internal passport or like international travel passport with a microchip can verifiably and completely securely, without sending any information anywhere, participate or initiate this type of online digital polls or like petitions or any type. You can like form it into any type of incentive or like the activism one can imagine. And you can then genuinely and securely, in a completely anonymous, preserving way, measure the sentiment of how people react to it. It's more or less, it has this kind of radical flavor because it was used mostly by the activists. But if we move to next slide, I kind of like want to highlight as well that this is not a per se anti-government or like this kind of anti-state or electoral system against mechanisms. It does not try to break it down, but in a perfect world scenario, I see this credible neutrality in the form of like this FreedomTool type of protocols working in parallel with the state systems and being this kind of a control mechanism as a kind of parallel constitutionally guaranteed environments where people can bare minimum, like, like use it as a kind of a pause button to a certain incentives. And by that, not only prevent this kind of radicalization, but as well, if wisely used by a wise, I don't know, ruler or like an end, like the government, it can prevent a lot of protest, polarization, and breakdowns of legitimacy that we see currently within these institutions, and especially in this like this kind of misinformation, narrative-driven. Now AI is going to be added to it era. So perfect scenario. It's not that much of anti, but it's more like an assistive tool of credible, neutral coordination that we didn't have. I'll go into with the next slide a bit more into like how it works and why it was not possible to this day. And if you look at the FreedomTool, it really has these two primary ingredients. One is the digital identity that is required to guarantee that each voter, in a completely privacy preserving way, is able to verify, for example, their citizenship or their age or certain attributes which are written into a digital ID. And actually, we found this kind of life hack. So digital passports, or like, I know that like overall digital passports and ID is a huge problem for the world population, especially in third world countries. But unfortunately, I don't have a kind of formula. How can we enable a legitimate, no, I mean this verifiable one person, one vote system without this digital identity aspect? Because each passport and ID has this kind of microchip, and this microchip is actually that we are, I'm going to say in brackets, like hijacking from the state system, because it enables you to, with using any smartphone that has an NFC reader, to put your ID, extract the information from a microchip that has a government signature, and you can guarantee the validness of all this data, but without sharing this information into any of the servers. Imagine like you creating this proof of who you are and that you're eligible to vote directly on your mobile phone. And then this magic cryptographic proof is something that gives you right to vote directly on a blockchain. So the second piece is this kind of, imagine like a ballot box, but this ballot box is not a centralized database, but it's deployed on a blockchain. So anyone can audit it, anyone can see the correctness of the execution of the process. And at the end of the day, for like last 10 years, we had a lot of like work and the open code base on this voting part. So we knew how to conduct voting and run these decentralized ballot boxes on chain. But what was missing, and this is a kind of contribution of FreedomTool, was that how do we bring now these real identities with this voting, so you can have a real world elections or like nation-based type of referendums or like polls deployed in a completely decentralized way. So there's no one who can trace it, who can switch it off, or who can like coerce or like somehow hijack the system from us. So this is the kind of back to this kind of credible neutrality and full decentralized systems that I was talking about. But aside from this kind of very hard stuff that I'm pretty sure mentioned while describing the system, if we go to the next slide, from a user perspective, who's just like new, completely new in terms of like using the system, it is pretty easy. So all they have to do, and anyone can actually create this anonymous blockchain powered poll now. So if you go into freedomtool.org, you're able to create your own poll, and it generates you a QR code. And what the user does then is basically has to have a smartphone, scans the QR code, the poll is pulled up, touches the national passport or like an internal ID to the phone, and is able to vote with a push of a button. So it's a pretty simple 3 steps, 3-click process to an end user. So a person doesn't have to be like well versed into blockchain or understand how these like systems work. All you need to know is like how to open up a smartphone, tap your passport with it, and scan a QR code just to vote. And I think like removing the complexity of UX that usually blockchains have was super important for this use case. Let's move to the next slide. It started off straight away. So once we announced this technology was out, we tested our waters like with different political or activist groups. So very first implementation of FreedomTool was used by a Russian oppositioner. Now, I mean, back then already in a kind of exile oppositioner who's on the list of this kind of terrorists within the Russia and has 11 years of prison time. But he's of course outside, so he was like the first person to actually see the value in this tool, and he started to mobilize more like a kind of a digital protest. So you can imagine it was not like a voting towards a certain candidate or like making a decision, but it was aligned with back then, last year presidential elections in Russia, where oppositioners were not able to even put themselves on the ballot. So it was more like a kind of digital protest where people would online sign that they don't share the kind of, they don't think that they share the legitimacy of this entire process, how the presidential elections are conducted. And we had there were like around 40,000 protesters, which is kind of a small number from like overall electoral number of Russia. But if you benchmark it with this, like street protests, right? So how many people came out on the street? 40,000 people is quite a lot. It definitely can feel most of the central squares of the cities that we know. So that was the start of this freedom tool, in a way. Then we had another, more like an activist initiative within Iran. So last year was actually the most active period for elections. So this was the year when like 2/3 of population of the entire world were participating in this or that form of election. So this was an election year. So launching a freedom tool was well aligned with what was going on around the world. So as soon this story was out, then Iranian activists more like a digital activist, reached out and they took the code base. So they actually like build everything from scratch themselves. And as well, it was used to like spread some information and like bring these early community members of their activists. The third version was in the country of Georgia, where originally I'm from. It was taken by the largest opposition party, but it had a different flavor. So there was a presidential, like a parliamentary elections last year, and this tool itself became a part of a promise by the largest opposition group within the country. So it became this kind of agenda where they said that, like, okay, if we come to power, this tool will become something when, I mean, Georgia, is a small country, is experiencing a lot of like emigration. So it has like the total population is about like 3.5 in Georgia, but about like 1.5 million people live outside of the country. And unfortunately, like they're not able to participate within the elections. Unfortunately, 2 weeks ago, the government made an incentive to just cut out all the immigrants outside of the country to legally participate in the election. So they won't be opening the polls, which is I mean, I don't know, very disappointing move for me as a Georgian. But overall, that was the kind of part of the promise. So if these people are not able to travel like hundreds of miles or are afraid to like be prosecuted or like deported from a country because most of them are like illegally in these places that they're not participating in elections. So the opposition party was using this foundation of the FreedomTool and the application they built on top as the kind of future of how a civilian can interact with the state. So how can they participate into decision making, into elections, into this kind of priorities, priority ranking, and etc. etc. Yeah, Georgian politics didn't go, unfortunately, the right way. Currently, the party leaders who initiated this, unfortunately, are in jail. So yeah, so it's not about, once again, it's not about just the technology and the amazing stuff we can do. It's as well a lot of like friction of a real world politics. And unfortunately, like, I don't know, especially in like authoritarian and this small states, you get in a lot of like backlash on a physical and individual level to all these people who are willing to bring change. But once again, like, just to like summarize, this entire like technology is completely open source, and all these like initiative groups, and I'm not going to be naming them right now, but there's a still from completely different part of the world that I even like. Okay, I can say I can't even like sometimes directly put a finger on the map where this country is. I'm always getting kind of reached out from these groups, and as the system and everything, like starting from application to blockchain part to like identity system is open source, people and different activist groups or even politicians are still experimenting. And even the ones who already tried, they all have this good kind of retention and this kind of new idea sparks of how the system could be used. And the very last slide, if we go, yeah, so I think like FreedomTool, it does have this tool thing, right, within this name, but in a way, for me, it's a kind of an ideology of how can we unite or bring communities more actively into decision making. And I think like technology has matured, and it was not possible 10 years ago. It was not even possible 5 years ago, because every ingredient we're using, from like the privacy preserving perspective, from like being able to verify your identity without sharing data, and this kind of blockchain voting, these are the fruits of this long 15 years blockchain revolution that has been going on. And only now we're we kind of like upbuild to introduce this credibly neutral system within the governance. And yeah, I guess I always say that, like, in a way, what I've told has happened in the last 12 months. So there's not much time has gone since we deployed it. And I believe that this is a kind of version 1, because behind it is the greater idea of participation, like, and this kind of online access to civilians, communities, and these groups to coordinate. And I'm always happy when there are people and builders and groups that have their own view of how can they use this tool and what problems it will solve from them in the future. And yeah, beside all this kind of friction, mostly political, that we experienced in the first year, I'm still very optimistic, because of like what has been created, and because of the people that I see, like including you, Gabriela, right, who find this huge interest into this thing.